I'm Noelle, and I recently finished Louise Gluck's book of poems, Averno. I became acquainted with her from the poem Gretel in Darkness, going off of the fairy tales I talked about last time. So I decided to buy this fairly recent book of poetry, which was very intense, sometimes painfully depressing, sometimes it was heartbreaking and moving, but then other times it was a bit too esoteric for me, and it made me realize that I love visceral poems that come across even as very short stories, things that are very tangible. And this reminded me of a couple books of poetry that I really love, but I haven't seen around too much. The first book of poems is Thomas Rabbitt's American Wake, New and Selected Poems. He has won awards for his poetry, national awards, and this book was published by my former employer, NewSouth Books. People have described his work as haunted, and I think that's a fair description. A number of these poems are about Ireland, as well as family relationships and loss, and especially between fathers and sons. One of my favorite poems is The Beasts of Cool Park, which is prefaced by a quote from William Butler Yeats, who wrote The Wild Swans at Cool. And it's a very short response to that poem, but it is memorable and powerful. Instead of watching swans like in Yeats' poem, he refers to himself as a wolf with wings, overseeing the park and a house. It's interesting to note that Yeats was living at Cool Park at the time when he wrote his poem. The other book of poetry I wanted to talk about is Valzhyna Mort's Factory of Tears. I first saw her reading at an AWP conference quite a few years ago in Chicago, and I found her poetry to be so raw and beautiful. She's published another book of poetry since then, but I haven't yet read it. She's from Belarus, and she writes in Belarus in order to, quote, explicitly reestablish the traditional language of her homeland. This book of poetry has been translated into English, but it has both the Belarusian version and the English version on each side of the page. She wrote this when she was quite young, and sometimes it shows, but I still really love this book of poetry. I remember her reading from the poem Belarusian 1. I'll just read the beginning of this poem. Even our mothers have no idea how we were born, how we parted their legs and crawled out into the world the way you crawl from the ruins after a bombing. We couldn't tell which of us was a girl or a boy. We gorged on dirt thinking it was bread, and our future, a gymnast on a thin thread of the horizon, was performing there at the highest pitch. Bitch. And it's not a very long poem, but the ending echoes the beginning about the mother's womb and even the gymnast, but it's a little bit more hopeful, I think. We discovered we ourselves were the language, and our tongues were removed. We started talking with our eyes. When our eyes were poked out, we talked with our hands. When our hands were cut off, we conversed with our toes. When we were shot in the legs, we nodded our heads for yes, and shook our heads for no, and when they ate our heads alive, we crawled back into the bellies of our sleeping mothers as if into bomb shelters to be born again. So it was really wonderful to read some poetry again, because I'd forgotten how transportive good poetry can be. I also think it might be good to take breaks between poems depending on the poet and the collection, because I think especially for me with Louise Gluck's poems, I really needed time to absorb those. And I don't know what I'd think of them if I read them again in the future, but I'm still really glad I got that. So anyway, thank you so much for checking it out, and feel free to look into those books I just recommended, and I hope you continue to write and read poetry again if you so desire. Bye!